Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. I am Mark Roselle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School. And this is the first event in 2019 of the Michael Hayden Center here at George Mason University. I would like to acknowledge a few persons in the audience here tonight and thank them for their attendance. Edward Dittmeyer, George Mason University Internal Auditor representing University Central Administration. Samit Shrivastava, the Board of Trustees of George Mason University, welcome. The Schar School is, for those who don't know, many of you I know are familiar with us, is one of 10 schools or colleges here at George Mason University. And we operate on both campuses in Fairfax as well as here in Arlington. And we offer numerous degree programs at the bachelor's, master's, and PhD levels, degrees in political science, public policy, public administration, a number of specialized master's degree programs, professional degree programs, such as international security studies, which is very germane to tonight's discussion. And we're about 1,700 students strong and over 16,000 alumni of the Schar School. We host a number of centers and institutes here at the Schar School that put on a number of these public outreach type programs on contemporary public policy issues, and also have had in the past and as well this evening book talks on topical issues in American politics. And I have to say that's a provocative title there, very interesting. I'm fascinated to hear what our guest author has to say. And so to introduce specifically this program, I would like to invite to the stage Larry Pfeifer, who is the Executive Director of the Hayden Center, and he will get us started. Larry?
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I know the weather today was not the nicest weather that we've had lately, so appreciate the effort you all made to be here. First and foremost, I know many of you are probably wondering about General Hayden. For those who aren't aware, General Hayden suffered a stroke in late November and was hospitalized for a period of time doing rehabilitation up at the National Rehabilitation Hospital up in Northwest DC. He did return home just this last Friday and is enjoying recuperating in the comfort of his home with his family. He is getting out and about. We've had at least one sighting at Tyson's Mall, and I was over visiting with him and his wife today, dropping off a dinner to help them out, and he's eager to get back into the fray. Some of you may have seen he co-authored an op-ed in the Washington Post this last week with Neil Katyal, former Solicitor General, that actually dovetails nicely with the topic we're discussing tonight. The Hayden Center, for those who don't know, has been around for about 18 months. We are one of the centers at the Schar School. General Hayden's goal for the center is to better inform the public debate and discussion on intelligence and ensure that people better understand how intelligence supports or sometimes doesn't support, helps or sometimes doesn't help policy-making decisions at the senior-most level. We're also here to enhance the educational experience for the students at George Mason at the undergraduate and graduate level as well. We largely are an events-based organization. If anyone interested in seeing the events we've done over the last 18 months can check out our YouTube channel or our website, and you can find all the videos there. A lot of very interesting events if you got some free time. If you're furloughed, you got lots of free time, go ahead and watch some of those videos. Speaking of previous events, I did just want to say a quick recognition to Greg Miller. Greg Miller is on the second row here, Washington Post reporter. He was one of our guest speakers earlier this academic year, back in November on election eve, talking about his book, The Apprentice. And if you haven't read The Apprentice, rush out and get The Apprentice before he has to write The Apprentice 2. So thank you again, Greg, for helping us out. In the thank you category, we can't do this by ourselves. Number one thanks goes to Dwight Schar, whom the school is named after. He's our donor and benefactor, and so we're very grateful to everything he's done for us. The Schar School itself, Dean Mark Roselle, Judith Wilde, and other members of the staff. We couldn't do what we're doing without them as well. Also, the Arlington campus event staff allows us to have events in this wonderful auditorium and supports us as well. Tonight, we're also getting support from the bookstore. If you didn't get a chance to buy your book before the event, the bookstore has been gracious enough to stick around beyond normal working hours, and they're going to set themselves up right outside the auditorium at the end of the event. Because I know once you hear about this book, if you haven't bought it yet, you're going to want to buy the book. Some other housekeeping stuff. If you hadn't already caught on, there are some cameras here. We're recording the event for use on our website and our YouTube channel. We also have C-SPAN here, who's covering the event for the Book TV show that airs on the weekends on C-SPAN 2. So if you enjoy tonight and you want to tell your friends to see the event, they can look for it either on our website or on C-SPAN. And thanks to C-SPAN for covering us. Questions and answer session will follow. Just would ask you to do three things. Number one, line up at these microphones that you see at the end of the aisles. The moderator will reach out and call you in turn. Please identify yourself, and if you've got an affiliation you'd like us to know about, please keep that short. And then we would just ask you to ask a question and not give a speech. That would be most appreciated. At the end of the event, we have a reception. The reception is for all of you, and I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of good leftover food, so eat lots, put some in your pockets, take it home with you. Tonight's event, the title, as Mark suggested, is a little provocative, How to Get Rid of a President. A couple things I'd like to note is the title is not Let's Get Rid of a President. It's not How Do We Get Rid of This President? So we're a university. Our goal and objective at a university is to educate and inform. We saw David Priess's book as an excellent example of a book that offers sort of a historic exposition of the subject. And as you'll hear tonight, they discuss all of the many, many ways in which we as Americans have disposed of our presidents. I won't get too much into that, but that's what we're going to be hearing about. That being said, it is, a topic du jour in Washington. So I imagine we may touch a little bit on, on the current president and some of the conversations that are surrounding his presidency and whether it should continue for another 2 years, 6 years, or even less time than that. In terms of introductions, we got two great people here to talk to you tonight. First and foremost is David Priess. He's the author of the book. David's connection to me, his connection to General Hayden, is that he is a former CIA officer. I would also like to make the public announcement that we are not CIA here trying to get rid of a president of the United States. This isn't some subterranean nuanced plot that we are cooking up here on stage. But he is a CIA analyst by background and trade. He has applied that analytic skills to subjects since he left government. He was with the CIA during the Clinton and the Bush 43 administrations. Of note, he served as a member of the President's daily briefing staff, his responsibilities being to brief FBI Director Mueller, who many of you know is currently involved in investigating the current Russian interference situation. He also briefed Attorney General Ashcroft at the time. In addition to this, wonderful book we're going to talk about tonight, another book he has written that I highly recommend is The President's Book of Secrets. This book looked at the history of briefing intelligence to presidents of the United States. Again, an excellent encapsulation of that subject. David, you may recognize him from television. He appears on many of the cable shows offering his commentary. He comments in print in a number of major publications. He recently joined the Lawfare Institute as their chief operating officer. And a little closer to home, he is a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute, which is a center located at our neighbor, the Antonin Scalia Law School. Our second speaker is Susan Glasser. Susan Glasser is graciously coming in here today and substituting for General Hayden, and we're very appreciative of her taking time out of her busy schedule to do that. Susan is a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine. where she is currently writing a weekly column on life in Trump's Washington. Appears every Friday. You can get it in the magazine. You can get it on the internet. She's also prominent on television and in other print media as well. Television, you'll see her on CNN as a global affairs analyst. She has been a top editor at several DC publications. Of most recent and prominent renown is, so she was a founder and editor at Politico magazine. She served as editor-in-chief at Foreign Policy, and before that spent a decade at the Washington Post in overseeing the Outlook section as well as national news. Germane to the subject tonight, during her time at the Post, she was in charge of overseeing the newspaper's coverage of the Clinton impeachment, so that will add to tonight's subject. She also, with her husband, served overseas in Moscow earlier in her career, and she and her husband, Peter Baker, of the New York Times now, produced a book called Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin and the End of Revolution, which was written back, I think, in 2005, but I have a feeling that it's a book, if you picked it up today, you'd probably find a lot of great insights that perhaps more people should have paid attention to 14 years ago. So with that, I'd like to invite our speakers out on stage, and thank you all for attending.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. And of course, thank you to all of you for sharing your time with us this evening. I'm delighted to be here with David, who has not only written an insightful book, but he's done so astonishingly quickly. And I say this as someone who, my husband and I have been working on the same biography of Jim Baker for the last 5 years. So congratulations to you. It is not, as I'm sure everyone here knows, the only entry in the how to get rid of a president sweepstakes these days. Before I was coming over here, I looked in my office and I saw a stack of books that have come out just in the last year. The Case for Impeachment, To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment, and Impeachment and American History, which is one that actually my husband, along with John Meacham and a host of others, contributed to. These are all just in the last year. Obviously, there's an elephant in the room, you could say, driving the conversation here. But I found your frame around it, though, to be really original and really, I think, helpful for us at this moment in time, which is to say, expanding the frame beyond impeachment or not, which may or may not be the most relevant historical parallel. Tell me a little bit, to start out tonight, why did you go for the broader look at, getting rid of a president? And, are there, do you think, more relevant ways to do so than impeachment?
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for the introduction as well. I was surprised when I started thinking about this topic, about what's going to happen with perhaps this president, but what has happened with other presidents who have broken bad in one way or another. Everyone focuses on impeachment, and yet we've never had a successful removal by impeachment. We've come close. Richard Nixon, I think, was removed by the impeachment process. He just resigned before it could finish. But we've never had that, and yet we've had 44 presidencies that ended. Every president has been removed by one means or another, and we've done that without only one civil war, but we've done that without societal violence over the removal of the executive. And that is surprising historically. Find me another country that has had 44 executive leaders in a row, and the removal of that executive leader did not prompt at least societal discord, if not outright violence. And I realize it's not all about impeachment. That's what everybody rushes to when you think about removing a president, but it's not all about impeachment. There are many other ways we can disempower or remove a president, perhaps in name only, but we can remove a president. Of course, the Times influenced it. I finished the last book in 2016, published it. That book, The President's Book of Secrets, was generally about presidents behaving well, presidents receiving their intelligence reports, making national security decisions based on them, with a few exceptions, doing it as you would expect them to do. I realized that's not the whole story. Some presidents don't behave so well, so I needed to balance my karma and write a book about presidents who perhaps were deemed unfit or otherwise unworthy of the office.
So, your point is well taken that although the founders envisioned impeachment and a trial as the proper method for dealing with a president who exceeds the bounds in some way of his authority. They only envisioned his when it came to presidents at that time. But it's never happened. It's never happened. There have been 3 presidents who've been impeached, and none of them has been convicted and removed in a trial. We now have the 25th Amendment, which is a different kind of removal from office. And then I realized, to me, the key insight, though, in your book was just to step back even more from that. We get all legalistic very quickly, it seems to me, when confronted with issues around presidents and their lack of suitability or lack of performance in office. Politics is the real way that presidents get removed. And you pointed out that actually political parties themselves have often done the job, even before subjecting an underperforming or unperforming president to the will of the voters in their general election.
Absolutely. And the founders, in their wisdom, came up with a method by which we could remove presidents a relatively easy way, which is every 4 years we have an election. And if you don't like the way the president is behaving, you can say, you're fired. That's the way it's supposed to happen. And in fact, it has happened many times. We just don't have that experience recently because we've had a lot of 2-term presidents in recent history. In fact, it's almost historically unprecedented. The beginning of the Republic had George Washington for 2 terms, John Adams for only 1, but then the next 3 presidents were all 2-term presidents. That didn't happen again until now. The last 3 presidents we've had, Obama, Bush, and Clinton, were 2-term presidents. And you skip just one-term president, George H.W. Bush, you have another 2-term president, Ronald Reagan. It's the only 2 times that's ever happened. So we're not used to that. We're not used to the fact that we can simply take an incumbent president who runs for re-election and say, you're out of here. That's the easiest way, but it doesn't have to wait till election day. You don't have to wait for the people to decide. Sometimes the party itself can decide, this is not our strongest candidate. That is also unusual to us now because it hasn't happened recently. Usually the powers of incumbency are so strong that that president inherits the ticket at the next election. You go back to the 19th century, parties were ditching their own presidents left and right. They found they could put a stronger person forward. So even before election day, you can remove a president by working within a party to say, oh, we can surely do better than this guy. And often they did.
So I guess the sort of counterpoint to that would be to say, okay, well, we had a lot of things that happened in the 19th century and the late 18th century that may or may not be relevant to today. And by the way, political dysfunction in the 19th century ended up with the Civil War. So maybe that's not the most comforting exercise. The more recent case, aside from the impeachment of both Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon, is the debate, such as it was, over introducing the 25th Amendment to the Constitution. That's the only other modern example of an effort to address, in constitutional terms, presidential dysfunction. Did they screw up with the 25th Amendment? I mean, I remember it was literally weeks into the Trump presidency. People immediately understood there were going to be all sorts of issues raised about not only whatever investigation found with the Russians, but that even basic questions around Trump's fitness for office or performance in office were likely to be raised, and quickly. And I remember having many conversations with people very early on. Well, what about the 25th Amendment? You don't hear a lot about that anymore because, in fact, people quickly realized the barriers to invoking that against the will of a still functioning president were basically politically impossible, and that is actually much easier to achieve impeachment and removal.
The 25th Amendment is harder both constitutionally and practically. Constitutionally, you've got to get 2/3. If the vice president and a majority of the cabinet decide the president is unable to perform the duties, then the president's done. You have an acting president in the person of the vice president. But if the president disagrees, the president can appeal that, and ultimately it goes to Congress, and it has to be a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. That's higher than impeachment. The bar for impeachment is a 2/3 impeachment in the House followed by a majority vote in the Senate. So it's constitutionally difficult.
Given in our current politics, it's basically impossible.
But it's even harder than that because, first of all, you have to have a vice president who's willing to look the president in the eye and say, sir, I think you're fundamentally unable to do the job. Different than unfit. That means you're unable, originally designed for a scenario like a coma or unconscious or somebody who has so obviously lost his mind that he's doing something like nominating chickens to cabinet posts. I can't imagine any vice president, much less Mike Pence, looking in the eye of the president who says, I've got this, I'm okay, and saying, no, sir, I disagree, and I'm going to get the majority of the cabinet to agree with me. So practically, it's a very high bar short of a coma type situation. If the president says he's okay, and we know from the experience, this has happened before, even before the 25th Amendment, we had a president who was disabled. We had Woodrow Wilson, who suffered a massive stroke and was unable to perform even the basic duties of the presidency. What happened? His wife and his doctor stepped in and told the cabinet and told the vice president, he's okay, we got this, you just can't see him. He's in seclusion upstairs, and we'll pass down his decisions. Well, the best history we have suggests that his wife was taking some liberties with things like taking his hand and signing with his hand on certain documents. Even then, the vice president was unwilling to step up and say, I don't think so, even without the mechanism of the 25th Amendment. With that, it's not going to be any different short of something like a coma.
Well, it does seem like whether it was that they made an effort to address a constitutional problem, but failed to really find a workable way.
And to their credit to some degree, because one thing that the drafters of the 25th Amendment did was consider the options, everything from physical disability to mental illness. They thought, who should decide? And they didn't want somebody else deciding. They wanted it to be difficult. They wanted it to be hard to execute what would look like, to most people, a coup.
Yeah.
They wanted to put a high bar there, and good for them. You don't want to have a situation where the president is constantly thinking the vice president is going to declare him disabled because he disagrees with policy and can get a simple majority to agree with him. So I think there's some value to having a difficult bar to jump over for the 25th Amendment. But it is there for a reason. It is there if there's a significant problem in decision making that people begin to question the sanity or the physical health of the president.
Well, it's funny, had we been having this conversation really, anytime up to the last few years, this would have seemed like one of those very interesting and appropriately academic discussions. But, we're having this conversation. It's not just about dysfunction, I would say, in America today or in Trump's Washington. You and I were talking backstage. There is a real world example of this playing out right now today in Venezuela. And the president of the United States, whatever you think of him, has taken a temporary hiatus from the gridlock of our own government crisis to jump right in and intervene in the middle of Venezuela's government crisis, where yesterday the young Speaker of the National Assembly declared himself, under the Venezuelan Constitution, the interim president of Venezuela. And the United States and a significant portion of the international community are agreeing with him. They say that the election of the incumbent president was illegitimate and that it did not meet standards for a real election last year, and therefore that Maduro was sworn in to a new term as president under unconstitutional pretenses.
Right.
Well, this is also a scenario that we can say is not merely academic anymore. It's actually happening in a major country in our hemisphere. And it is also a scenario by which it reminds you one person's vision of a constitutional act is not another person's vision of a constitutional act. It's what happens when democracies break down. And I think, to me, that's reading over your book. We have this great historical examples, but there is that question of, in a gridlocked America, just as in a gridlocked any other country, is any of this history really, how relevant is it?
It's funny, I came to this not as an intelligence project. I was a PhD in political science before I ever worked at CIA, and this book really is visiting back to that. But I couldn't help but be informed by my experience working intelligence, because I work the Middle East, and there's no shortage of cases of removing executives in Middle Eastern countries outside of what we would call constitutional means. That is, being a societal conflict to do that. And I realized that's not our experience as a country. We've had relative stability, with some bumps along the way, but we've had relative stability. But I couldn't help but be informed by that and look around the world, and especially teleporting back to 1787, when the founders wrote the Constitution and were devising this system of government whereby the executive could have enough authority to do the job, but not so much authority to oppress the rights of the people. And what what a concept that was, because there were few good cases in history they could build on to show that this would even work. It was an experiment. And what's happened in the 200 and some years since? We've seen history continuing in many parts of the world where you have cases of not just constitutional crisis like we're seeing in Venezuela, but where the constitutional crisis almost immediately defaults to societal violence and a ripping apart at the seams. The fact that we're still seeing this tells us two things. First of all, we can't take for granted that institutions work, that the institutions need to be backed by people making decisions. Number two, we've got it pretty good because our institutions are strong enough that even when under duress, they seem to be holding most of the time. So my eye gave me a perspective in both of those ways, that we've got it good in ways we don't realize, but that does not let us off the hook for being vigilant.
Well, I think to me that's been the interesting thing really in the last couple of years, right? You could argue the sort of taking solace in history both ways. Yeah. You can go back and read a pile of Watergate books and come out and say, well, the system worked. Oh, this is okay. We can survive this. Yeah. Or you can go back and you can say, well, that is how tested the system was, and that was in 1974, before all the trends that have led to the freeing of our democracy. And, we're on day 34 of a U.S. government shutdown that's lasted longer than any before, and in which norms that we thought were settled and established have basically been blown past.
And that has been the story of the last 2 years, right, is the norms and institutions that many people took for granted. And I don't care whether it's offering up your tax returns during the campaign, or whether it's simply how a president communicates to the people. Those have been shattered. And the danger there, of course, is that we, and I mean we collectively, regardless of where you are politically, we become desensitized to the fact of norms and institutions mattering at all. Because if we're surviving as a country, and we're surviving in day, 34 of a shutdown, well, maybe the norms and institutions don't matter that much after all, because most of the country is still okay, right? And we learn that it's okay to break down those traditions. Okay, maybe we're strong enough, we're resilient enough that we can get by without those institutions, but they're there for a reason. And one day we will discover, I fear, I hope not, but I fear we'll discover that those institutions were really useful. And those did help us against some elements that once they get out of control are very hard to bring back in.
Well, so you mentioned how does your intelligence background and fit into a project like this that on the surface seems unrelated to look at American history. If you were writing a dispassionate analysis and it wasn't about the U.S., it was about some other country, right. How would you purge out this sort of American exceptionalism from this historical record?
Well, I'll tell you, you could be an intelligence analyst and write a piece of analysis for any president. In Donald Trump's world, supposedly in bullet form, he likes getting his analysis in very short elements. For some other presidents, in longer form of text or briefings. But you could write a piece of analysis for the president about what's going on, say in Venezuela, and you could do it based on just the intelligence reporting coming in that day, from human intelligence sources on the ground, from signals intercepts of Venezuelan communications, from satellite imagery. And you could probably tell the president something useful about what's happening right now. But most presidents, and I interviewed the living presidents and vice presidents at the time for my first book, most of them agreed what really gave the intelligence analysis richness was understanding the history, understanding the context, understanding those norms and institutions and how the current players are interpreting those and acting upon them. There's something about understanding the history behind not only the country, but also the political processes. And that's one reason, looking at this book, I wanted to go back to the presidents whose names I hardly remembered. John Tyler, Andrew Johnson, Millard, Fillmore, I'd learned those names, couldn't have told you one thing about them. But now I realize that's part of our history of how the norms developed about presidential behavior. That's the same way that the President of the United States benefits from rich intelligence analysis that says, this is what's going on in Venezuela today, but you can't understand the dynamics behind it without understanding what has gone before and what people in that country learned from their own history. That helps you actually anticipate what's going to happen in a way that just reading the day's intelligence take doesn't do.
Okay, so I'll bite. What does Millard Fillmore have to do with Donald Trump?
Wow. Millard Fillmore, in addition to having odd hair, I'll give them that. You have to look at pictures of some of those 1800s presidents. Martin Van Buren could never get elected today. My son calls him Mr. Crazy Hair, and there is a reason for that. Many of those presidents, including Millard Fillmore, the idea was they were president. They were the leader of their party, and then they didn't get renominated. And we say that could not happen now. As you said, dynamics are different now than they were in the 19th century. But really, are they? We have to remember, it was within our lifetimes, maybe not everyone's in the audience, but within our lifetimes that George H.W. Bush was primaried from the right and had a serious challenge from Pat Buchanan. In some of our lifetimes, it was Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Yes, he declared he was not running again because he was focusing on Vietnam. But in the book, I tell the story about how he was really working behind the scenes, expecting that the convention in Chicago would call him as the savior of the party that was being ripped apart to come in. And in fact, he had Secret Service agents planning his route to fly from Texas to Chicago, how they would get in the convention hall, and he could be acclaimed as the nominee. That's relatively recent history. This can still happen. A Millard Fillmore situation can still happen in today's world.
I think it's an excellent point. People often mistake it. If you look, in fact, at the modern one-term presidents, it is weakness within their party, not outright dumping by the party. But Jimmy Carter is the other one. There's a new book out, which I recommend, about the 1980 race between Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, which no question contributed to Carter's ultimate defeat by Ronald Reagan.
Right, and there's no reason that should change now. In fact, you look at the political discourse within what's left of the Republican Party, and you see that. You see people talking about Donald Trump, especially his supposed compromise for the shutdown, saying, well, he's gone too far by even mentioning DACA. In a sense, people staking out a position on the right. And then you see plenty of people who are out there in the moderate wing of what was the Republican Party saying, that's not what we stand for. They're there. Now, do they have enough momentum to make a serious primary challenge? Most of the time, a couple of years before an election, it doesn't look that way. And many times in history, by the time you get to 6 months or 9 months before the election, it very much looks that way, and you have a very strong challenger.
So a lot of what you're saying suggests that you are very skeptical that impeachment is the preferred course of action at this moment in time. Are you skeptical because you don't think it would be successful, because you don't think it's politically wise? Where does that come from?
Yeah, impeachment is a funny thing because it's so influenced by the most recent experience with it. In the 19th century, the first impeached president, and there had been other attempts, there had been other impeachment resolutions introduced, but the first successful impeachment was against Andrew Johnson, who was a historically awful president. He was, and I don't know him personally, he was before my time, but he was a historically awful human being as well, a racist, aggressive to his friends as well as his enemies. He was, in many ways, our worst president. And he was impeached. He was not removed. The Senate declined to remove him by 1 vote. It was very close. But what happened? It moderated his behavior. The impeachment itself was seen as a rebuke, and Andrew Johnson was never a good president, but he was a better president after the impeachment and after the removal vote failed. Okay, so the lesson after that was, you'd better behave or else you're going to get this slap across the face from the House of Representatives, the will of the people saying, you need to behave better, and you're going to have to reform your behavior or else you might get removed. That was the lesson for decades. Fast forward to Bill Clinton. You know this better than I do, but the lesson of the Bill Clinton case for many people in politics was, if you impeach the president and you fail to remove the president, you've lost. That's a political failure on the part of those bringing the impeachment. What a different lesson than the Johnson case. The Johnson case was a rebuke. The Clinton case, his popularity ratings went up from the beginning of his presidency through his impeachment. The lesson was, you win if you don't get convicted. If that's the frame that people have now, and we have to remember some of the people in the Senate are people who were there during the Clinton impeachment, then yes, it looks like if you bring an impeachment and you're not certain of conviction, it will be seen as support to the president. It need not be that way. That is not the founder's intent. The impeachment itself is supposed to be a rebuke. And there's no reason we can't get back there. But it does take something else. And this is a chapter I write about in the book, that you don't have to remove a president physically from the office in order to undermine the president. You can essentially remove them in place. The Andrew Johnson case, Congress passed a law, the Tenure of Office Act, where they restricted the president's powers so much he could not even remove some cabinet officials without permission of the Senate. It was a combination of the impeachment and the legislature doing its job with a lot of aggression. In fact, that act was later ruled unconstitutional, but they boxed Johnson in. So a combination of impeachment along with other means could actually restrict the president quite a bit in a way we certainly haven't seen in the last 2 years.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Johnson case, and the thing about that, right, was that it was fundamentally, although Johnson, as you point out, was a terrible person and a terrible president, they didn't impeach him because he was a bad guy, and they didn't impeach him due to even his own like personal misconduct or criminality.
Right.
It was actually a conflict over executive power and the relative roles of the two branches, and his desire to appoint people. He really wasn't from the same party as his own party.
And I will say he was not convicted in part because they were not that judicious in the articles of impeachment. Yes, they had articles of impeachment about things that we would now categorize as abuse of power, which was certainly going on there. They also had an article of impeachment that essentially said, the president is saying nasty things about Congress to the public. Wow. If that were an article of impeachment in today's world, we would have successive presidents who have been impeached and removed. They were not very judicious with it. And I pair that off with the primary case I used to talk about impeachment, which is the Nixon case. In the Nixon case, Peter Rodino and the others on the Judiciary Committee were very careful about what they were judging impeachable. They ruled out some things that some of their own caucus was saying, we must impeach based on this, be it actions in Cambodia, be it the president's questionable tax issues. No, they focused explicitly on issues of abuse of power, obstruction of justice. And that's why Nixon would have been impeached had he stayed in office a matter of weeks longer. It was a successful impeachment process, even though he resigned before it could see its conclusion. So a lot of it has to do with what the impeachment articles now. My mind tells me that's why Speaker Pelosi and others are being very judicious, if you will, about dropping impeachment resolutions. One has already been dropped since the new Congress came into effect, but it has not been referred to the Judiciary Committee to start hearings. They're waiting to get all of the goods they can, probably waiting for the Mueller investigation to release enough information that they can build articles of impeachment that don't look petty, but look like high crimes and misdemeanors.
Well, that's right. I've always felt that it was a sort of ridiculous debate where people say, well, see, Pelosi isn't in favor of impeachment, and therefore they think impeachment is terrible. Like, if you want impeachment to succeed, and I don't know whether they will ultimately pursue it or not, but this is I would not pay attention to this conversation if I were, the listening public. I mean, it's basically an absurdity, because if you are going to pursue it, you want it to succeed, which means you want it to be perceived to be a fair and judicious process, which means you need to wait for evidence.
Absolutely, and that's where the lessons I write about in the book on impeachment. And you're right, many good books have been written on impeachment. If you're interested in the topic, you will be occupied for a long time reading all these books. But there were many cases of impeachment articles that were introduced that were not acted upon, even with somebody like Andrew Johnson, when it was clear that he was a bad man and a worse president. And they did not pursue impeachment at that time. They waited. The only danger there is that when there are things that might be considered high crimes and misdemeanors, but you're waiting for just that one more thing, and then that one more thing, and then, well, maybe the investigation will bring even more, you can get to the point where it's the middle of the next election year, and people are thinking, shouldn't we just wait for the people to decide? Now, Jim Comey, who among all people probably has a good reason to be interested in impeaching this president, Jim Comey came out last year and said very directly when asked by ABC News, said, should we impeach the president? He said, absolutely not. He said, that's a decision the American people need to make directly. We shouldn't do it indirectly by a means like impeachment. Okay, if it gets closer to the election, that's going to be a harder argument to surmount. Now, there's enough material out there to build some impeachment articles, but waiting for that perhaps Mueller investigation or other news to come to light just pushes it down the road even further.
No, I think your point about the time frame is a very real one. I think the politics has been somewhat misunderstood, but I think if you realistically are into 2020, it's going to change. So here we are in January 2019, and I do feel like that's where the clock is at. So I want to get our audience here, and please do start to think about what your questions are. And while you're getting ready with those questions, I'm going to exercise my prerogative here and ask you something that's a little bit outside of the frame of the book, although I think it is relevant. A lot of people don't really understand, and I'm not sure I myself really do, why it is that we have seen So many people like yourselves who come out of the national security establishment. That includes certainly General Hayden as well. You mentioned Jim Comey. He may have a more specific reason, but I'm thinking of people like General Hayden. I'm thinking of people like Jim Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, who I did an interview with him last year. And as you know, he's become a very vocal and public critic of President Trump and worried about the impact of all this. Up until that point in time, I read every profile that had been written about Jim Clapper. You know what they all said? They said, this guy hates the press. He doesn't want to talk publicly about anything. He's the most publicity-shy person in the world. He's a career loyalist to the U.S. government. He has no
things are still true.
He has no politics. This man, there's not a partisan bone in his body. That's what one of the pieces before this said. So what is it about this particular subset of Americans? I mean, it's not the only group of people who define themselves in a pretty nonpartisan or bipartisan way.
Yeah. All of those things are still true about General Clapper. And I won't speak for him, but I'll use his own words, paraphrased. He said he's the last person he thought would be out there speaking about a current administration. He is shy. He does not want to be in the media, and yet he is. What does that tell you? That tells you something extraordinary is happening, and he feels that it is, he's duty-bound to call out truth as he sees it. And no one has expressed that better than General Hayden. General Hayden has spoken on the value of the truth, on the value of objectivity first, of rule of law first. Then we want to get back to the place where politically we can argue about the best marginal tax rates. But first, we have to get the fundamentals right. And when the fundamentals are under assault, then it's an obligation to speak out. I will say there's a different dynamic, though, between my position and that of people like General Hayden and General Clapper. These were career military officers involved in intelligence for decades who rose to lead their organizations in the US government. And they probably feel, and they have expressed this in different words, they probably feel that their institutional experience says they recognize when they need to break that taboo, and they've recognized it is a taboo. Former military officers, former intelligence officers traditionally do not speak out against a new administration. They don't. And yet they are. And I believe every former director and deputy director came out against the revocation of John Brennan's security clearance. Even when some of them didn't agree with the way that John was talking publicly about the president, they said, but we do not want the politicization of security clearances. That is something that makes us different than a lot of countries, that we have an objective clearance process so that it's not a political game every 4 years. That's at the director level. They're, in a sense, speaking out, saying, based on my lifetime of experience, this is not normal, and here's why. My case, yeah, I worked at CIA. I was an analyst for a few years, a manager, a briefer. I did those things. That was a part of my life, but I've been a US citizen a whole lot longer than I've been a US citizen and a CIA officer. So I'm calling it like I see it, perhaps with that experience informing me, but primarily speaking as David Priess, not as former CIA. General Hayden can't help it when he speaks publicly, and Jim Clapper can't help it when he speaks publicly without having CIA director or director of national intelligence under his name. That defined their career because that was the pinnacle of their work. But in all cases, there's a dynamic when it comes to intelligence that is different than politicians talking about politics. And it's the fact that current intelligence officers cannot, and I would say should not, be out there commenting on anything that could be perceived as political, even if it's simply trying to call objectivity what it is. They can't be perceived as political. They should be putting their heads down and doing their job. And those of us who know people in the intelligence community know that's exactly what they're doing. Right now, they're putting their heads down and they're doing their job despite the distractions, despite the historical oddities of the last 2 years. They're still serving not just the president, but the thousands of other intelligence customers throughout the executive and legislative branch. They're doing their jobs. Well, who's speaking up for them when their jobs are under assault? Honestly, it's people like General Hayden, it's people like General Clapper, speaking out for the things that they would say if they could, and they never speak in the name of the people who are doing their jobs. They don't pretend to, but they're speaking up for the principles that they learned when they led those organizations. I think there's something good about that, and there's something dangerous about that, because it does break a taboo, and how far do you go to break a taboo to protest other taboos being broken?
Well, that's right. We're right back in this circular question of, when you shatter through the norms, you don't pick and choose which ones are, good and which ones are bad, especially because you don't know what the consequence is of that until it
Absolutely.
happens.
And it does link, but your point does link back to the book, because
Yeah.
one of the norms I talk about is there's one president at a time, and the president gets the loyalty of those whom the president picks to support him. And that can be a direct pick in terms of a cabinet secretary, or it can be the millions of people who work throughout the executive branch departments. Well, what happens when you get something like you saw last year, when you have an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times by somebody claiming to be a senior administration official saying, don't worry, America, we got this. We're undermining the president. We are taking his misguided impulses and we're pushing back against those. So the stuff you see is the stuff we're letting through, but the worst stuff makes you wonder what the worst stuff was. But the worst stuff, we're squelching that. And at the same time, Bob Woodward's book came out, Fear, where he describes, among other things, a senior administration official taking a memo off the president's desk, hoping he would forget it so that he wouldn't abrogate a free trade agreement with South Korea. Well, that's violating some norms. There is a norm of faithful service in the United States government that you execute what the president says to execute, or you resign and you say why. Well, here are people not doing either. Here are people not executing what the president says to execute and undermining him from within. Well, guess what? That's an ethical norm that the next president is really going to want, and it is being undermined. I don't envy the people making that choice, because I think the people doing those things think that they are protecting national security. They think that they're doing the right thing for the country. And yet you think about the logic of it, how many people among the, 9 million employees and contractors in the executive branch, how many of those people have the right to ethically overrule the President of the United States who is duly elected? That's an ethical dilemma that most of us would never want to be in.
Well, that is true. So I'm going to let you ask some questions. Let me see some hands here. In the meantime, you can answer this one for us, which is, okay, go ahead.
Go to the microphones.
Good.
Yeah.
Just do us a favor and identify yourself and make it a question if you can.
Of course.
Thank you.
My name is Theo. I'm a sophomore here. Don't have any other credentials that you asked for. But my question is that you, having worked directly for Special Counsel Mueller, or now Special Counsel Mueller, and your sense of a current political scene, is there a scenario, like based on I'm sure you know the history of Watergate and the Republicans turning on Nixon, in which the crimes that the Mueller investigation would uncover about the president would be serious enough that he would either resign or actually have the vote, or the votes in the Senate would be there to convict?
Sure, thank you. 2 points. First, to do a corrective, I never worked for Bob Mueller. I worked for CIA and I briefed Bob Mueller. And believe it or not, when it comes to intelligence briefings, there's a huge difference. Because my job was to tell the Director Mueller at the time the truth as the analysts at the CIA saw it. And sometimes that meant telling him things he did not want to hear, because it was counter to things he'd said or counter to things that were, in a sense, FBI or even presidential policies. And yet that was my job. And thankfully we have that norm in our country. Not all countries have this, of telling truth to power so they can make better decisions based on actual fact. So yes, I got to work with him 6 mornings a week for over a year, got to know him really well, but I was not working for him, I was working to help him make his decisions. When it comes to Watergate, what's really funny is I hear a lot of people now saying things like, well, sure, Republicans turned on Nixon in Watergate, but that could never happen now. Look at what people in the Republican Party, especially in Congress, are saying about Trump. There's no way they'd ever turn on him. And I looked back at what was happening in early 1974. Pretty much what they were saying then is the Republican Party will not turn on Nixon. And then what happened? What looked like it was impossible one day, a few days later in July 1974, suddenly didn't look impossible, it looked inevitable. And it can turn like that. Now, what is that turning point? Some people think some of the things that have already happened would have been that turning point, and it did not happen. But certainly there is something that will get that person, we don't know who that person is, perhaps a senator, perhaps a representative, more likely a senator, to come out and blisteringly say, enough is enough, we've had enough, this is the final straw. And then we look for who the first follower is. Because when you get the first follower, then you get the effect. It's what happened with Nixon. And it led to senators going in to President Nixon, former Senator Nixon, one of their own, and saying, you're done. You don't have the votes. Long before Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote a song about that. No, they told him, you don't have the votes. And guess what? Nixon resigned. Now, the big question remaining here, the big difference from Nixon, is Nixon had been an officer in the US military. He had been a senator. He had been vice president. He had been president. Regardless of his obstruction of justice and abuse of power, something in him still loved and respected his country. Donald Trump doesn't have any of those same experiences. And the big unknown is, would he resign to spare the country the agony of an actual confrontation where he is removed from power in the Senate?
Can we take a vote on that here? What do you guys think?
Or would he relish in the fact of the greatest reality show of all time, which is watching it all burn down? That's the big unknown. Early on in the administration, talked with a lot of people who said, Nixon resigned. Trump would probably resign rather than be humiliated by a vote in the Senate. Would he? Or would he say, you know what, speaking to his supporters, say, you know what, I came to Washington to clean it up. And the establishment is so entrenched. Look at what they're doing to me. You know what? Let's push it. Let's see if we can get a fight. That's what worries me. Thank you.
Well, we'll call on the next questioner, but to add on to your point, I think it's a very important point about how quickly it can turn. The fact of where the politics on the Hill are today is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. Number one, it's a lagging indicator of where polls and public opinion are, i.e. it reflects it rather than pushing it or leading it. Number two, if you go back to the Nixon case, I was really struck in rereading my predecessor, Elizabeth Drew, wrote this letter from Washington column that I'm now writing during the Watergate period. And if you read her book that was later collected of those pieces as it unfolded in that culminating Watergate year, what I was really most struck by was literally 24 and 48 hours before the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach the president, she was interviewing and speaking with Republican members of the House Judiciary Committee who were uncertain how they would vote. 24 hours later, they held hands together basically and jumped off the cliff, and all the undecided Republicans voted for impeachment. Now, there were still a few Republicans who did vote against it, but basically all the undecideds broke against Nixon. And the conventional wisdom of a month previously was completely exploded. Now, of course, you had in the intervening time the Supreme Court case involving the Nixon tapes, and that really was the end of the end for Nixon. So without an external event to drive it forward, we don't actually know what the politics would have been. But I do think people often forget the uncertainty and the speed with which even congressional vote counts can absolutely reverse.
And then when it happens, or if it happens, but when it happens, people will look back and say, well, of course.
Right.
We all knew it would happen that way. Well, remember what it was like before then. It sure doesn't feel that way. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Mike Anderson from the Department of Defense. When we changed the Constitution, so senators were no longer elected by the states, but they became direct election.
Right.
Do you think that influenced not only the impeachment process, but just senators standing up to the president? And if so, how do you think that changed the process?
It can, but remember the Nixon and Clinton impeachments were after that. So impeachment processes have moved forward even with that. But it does get to the larger question of how much democracy do we have and how much do we want? It's expressed now mostly in the Electoral College itself, which is we do not have direct election of the president. It's mediated, just as the senatorial elections were once mediated through the popular vote. That by itself probably is not the key factor. I would put that among the variables that affects a removal vote when there's a trial in the Senate. I think the bigger factors are that idea of, will senators get together and say, you know what, we're undecided, and this is what happened in Watergate. They got together and they actually talked and said, you know what, yeah, we're seeing this, we got to act together. And if they do that, you know what, once enough people do that, if there's a conviction in the Senate, they go back to their publics and they say, well, look, it was obvious everybody else was doing it. In a sense, they have a shield from any public effect that might be against it. You have to remember that even as Nixon got impeached, his approval rating was something around 25, 26%, right around there. And I haven't kept up on every poll with this president, but I believe the most recent polls have him in the mid-30s, if that's about right. Yeah. And that is an important difference, but it's not a huge difference. Richard Nixon, less than a year before his resignation, was around the same level. And what a year it was that followed that. Thanks.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, hello, my name is Alexander Stoltz. Thank you very much. I think underpinning this entire discussion is a notion of how robust is American democracy. And basically, you went into detail describing all the various mechanisms by which the U.S. can both safeguard its democracy and also by which one can remove the U.S. president. Now, I personally find Trump to be morally disgusting and a narcissist. I think that a lot of the objections to Trump were all around that. However, what I'm personally more afraid of, and I'd like to ask you this in particular, in the event that Trump is removed, and let's just say Vice President Pence comes in, I'm actually much more worried about American democracy then, specifically because I think that Pence is a clean-shaven, polished version of what is, I believe, to be a Christian, quasi-fascistic undercurrent in the Republican Party, as well as, I think, broader speaking, American society. And I'm much more worried about a Pence Christian fascistic coup d'etat within the American system than a disgusting, morally bankrupt narcissist like Trump.
Can you
Thank
tell
you.
us what you really think? You go dark fast, my friend. Let me go micro and then macro. On the micro level, I don't know Mike Pence, but people who have worked with him, he wasn't a machine politician in the full sense of that phrase, but he was an experienced politician within the party in a way that Donald Trump never was. So seeing his behavior now, which is what most of us look at most of the time, may not be representative enough of his life experience to say what he would be like if something happened, be it an impeachment, a 25th Amendment ruling, or something else that removed the president, a resignation. Honestly, I don't know what's going to happen on the president's Twitter feed. We could all check it right now and find out he resigned, and I would not be totally surprised. So there could be a Vice President Pence who becomes a President Pence for many reasons. The experience of the last 2 years might not govern how he would govern. So that's the micro level. The macro level, it's funny looking at the history of this. Do you remain optimistic or pessimistic about the American experience as it relates to presidents? There's no way you can read this book. There's no way I could research this book and all of the experiences of American presidents and look at how many objectively bad presidents we've had and be completely optimistic about our method of selecting presidents and putting them into office. You feel like there's some real opportunities for improvement there. And it can make you really depressed. It can make you feel like if the best system of government that humanity has yet designed can get it wrong this many times, we're doomed for failure. Or you can look at it, and this is where I ultimately came around to, or you can look at it and say, we've gotten it that wrong that many times. And yes, we've had one civil war along the way, but we've gotten it that wrong that many times. And we've not only survived as a country, we've thrived as a country. We've gotten better because of those dark experiences. And it's hard to be completely pessimistic. You have a note of optimism about our country and our future, despite some of the personalities involved who have been president or have been close to the presidency. But that also is important to hold on to that optimism because that's what gives you the sense, the passion that you have comes from that. If you believe there's no hope, if you believe all we do is elect bad presidents and it's getting worse, and I don't even like the vice president, so even that solution isn't going to work, you lose the energy for activism. You lose the energy to actually engage and do something. Well, we need that. Regardless of where you are politically, we have to be invested in our country, or else we're never going to get through any valleys to get to the next mountain. Thanks.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Yep.
Thank you.
My name's Maria Kristen. I'm a retired federal government historian and an archivist at the National Archives. Of course, the National Archives is now closed during the government shutdown, but I remember seeing you at your book lecture for President's Book of Secrets. I was the team leader in charge of processing the Watergate tapes. I was the first person to listen to all of them, and I also worked out the national security classification restriction standards that I trained my staff to do. But in that capacity, I also had a chance to talk to H.R. Haldeman. We interviewed him for an oral history. And within the last few years, I've also talked to Dwight Chapin, who was an assistant to Haldeman. And there's a gray area between executing an order and deciding not to do it, and that is to slow walk a president's request. And this is something that Haldeman did very often. Nixon tended to vent during his meetings, and you heard this before and after the Watergate burglary. And he would say, "God damn it, Bob, I want whatever he wanted." And Bob would write it down on his yellow legal pad. And then he would go back to his office and he would tell his staff, "This one we're going to do, this one we're not going to do yet." And then he would slow walk it. And that gave Nixon a chance to cool down. And then he would say, "Did you do it yet, Bob?" And Bob would say, "No, not yet." And Nixon would ask 2 weeks later, "Well, did you do it?" And Bob would say, "No, we haven't quite done it yet." And then Nixon would ask in the third week, "Have you done it?" And Bob would say, "No, not yet." And Nixon would just say, "Just as well." And then he took it off the table. So there is that gray area, and that reminds me of what you wrote in President's Book of Secrets about how you tailor your briefings to the individual personality and temperament and your read on the man whom you're briefing. So I do see a connection between what you're saying in your new book and what you said in your last book, too. And I really would advise people to read both books.
Well, thank you, and more importantly, thank you for your service. Those of you who study history, who enjoy reading about history, whether popular versions of it or the actual raw material, people like you are to thank for that. That's where it comes from. Two quick reactions. First, on the Nixon case, absolutely. In the research on this, watching what Haldeman did, sometimes it wasn't as clear as that. Sometimes, and Haldeman himself admitted this when he wrote up his diaries and annotated, he said, "Well, sometimes I got orders from President Nixon that I just thought were him blowing off steam, but we had an understanding that sometimes, he did that and I would just not act on things." But then why would Nixon come back and say, "Well, have you done it yet?" If there was really this understanding. Haldeman was fooling himself to some degree. He wasn't the only one. Alexander Haig, who followed him, was even worse at times. Henry Kissinger, he wrote things in the name of the president at times. In one case, a letter to Brezhnev in the name of the president, and he didn't even talk to Nixon beforehand. So these things do happen. The issue of how far you go to adapt to the president's personality. If you're adapting something like an intelligence briefing to the president's style, good, that's customer service. If you're changing the content of it to please the president, that's politicization, and you're not actually helping the president make decisions. Staffers have a harder problem because they're not dealing with the same objective truth, if you will, an intelligence assessment. They're trying to gauge by the personality of the president, well, how far can I push him on this? How far can I help him save himself? Because this isn't going to help him. In the Nixon case, there's one time where Nixon said, "Let's bomb Damascus." I don't know if you remember that tape. But you know what? Let's just bomb Damascus. We weren't at war with Syria. And he said we should bomb Damascus. Now, what should happen, according to the actual textbook of American government? You bomb Damascus. He's the commander-in-chief. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And I think even Nixon would say, I'm glad that didn't happen. But what about the 200 other times? Al Haig, Haldeman, Kissinger, they were acting as president in that case. I devote a whole chapter to it in this book because I find that's one of the most interesting cases. You're essentially removing the president in place. You're undermining him to the extent that he doesn't exercise the full powers and duties of the office. And yet you are his own people. You're his own hand-picked supporters. Imagine what the opponents do. And we have some cases of that as well. The Nixon case probably is the most fascinating across all of these because we have almost all of these methods either attempted or actually used. And guess what? It worked. The president left.
What a great note to end it on. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you, David, as well.
Thank you.
So thanks, everybody, for coming. As I mentioned, we've got this great reception. I'd like you to stick around. You have an opportunity, if you've got a book, or if you don't have a book, buy a book. David's going to be around to sign books, answer any more questions you may have. Susan, hopefully stick around a little bit as well and get a chance to chat with her. Stay tuned. Our next Hayden Center event should be coming on the 11th of March. It'll be part of our Accountability of Intelligence series, looking at congressional oversight. We've already got confirmation from former House Intel Chairman or Chairpersons Jane Harman and Mike Rogers. We also have confirmation from Senator Saxby Chambliss, who was Vice Chair of the Senate Intel Committee, and we're waiting to hear back from our other senator, and so hopefully we'll have some announcements to make in the near future. So one last round of applause for our wonderful panelists.